Should you invest the time to learn how to code macros in Excel? That's a question I'll attempt to answer in this video. I've been using macros for over a decade now, and I didn't take any formal course, and I just learned it on the fly at different jobs. I'd explore how things can be automated, especially repetitive tasks that I was doing over and over again. I thought macros could save a lot of time, and they did. And in this video, I'll show you some of the ways that you can quickly create macros and the benefits of doing so, and how you could assign that to buttons so that you can quickly do those tasks over and over again, especially if they're repetitive ones. So here I've got a sample data set that's got quantity, price, different sales details. So let's say I download this data set every day. And every day I need to add a column for total sales to tabulate all this and maybe apply some formatting. So I could do this manually, but what I could also do is use Excel's macro recorder. If you don't see the developer tab on your file, then go to the Excel options. If you go to File, Excel Options, there's an option to enable the developer tab. Once in there, you'll see that option to record a macro. If I click on this, I can specify a name, or I can just hit OK, and it starts recording. I can click Stop Recording once I'm done. And so I'm going to start by selecting this cell here, type in total sales, and let's say I want to multiply the price by the quantity. Copy this down, double click to align this, and then let's say I also want to copy the formatting over from the price column, which actually shrinks my column. And let's say I want to change the color as well, the background color to black, the font to white. So now I've made several changes onto here. And if I go back to the developer tab, hit stop recording, open up Visual Basic, you'll see that there's a modules folder that's been created in here. Module 1 is by default where my macro was created. So here you can see all the steps that were recorded as I was using the macro recorder. So I selected cell G1. I put in a value of total sales. Again, I did an auto fit for column G. I pasted the formats over, applied some coloring, adjusted the font. So all those steps are recorded in here. So, just by looking at this, you can sort of see, how you might adjust this. Like, let's say you auto fit column G, but let's say in a later data set, you're doing the auto fit for column H or columns A through H, right? You could adjust that from right in here. And so that's where learning the syntax can be an effective way to start coding, even if you're not sure exactly every line of code that you could possibly do. It's a good starting point. And so let's say the next day I come in and I don't want to do these steps manually. I go back into Visual Basic and I want to run that macro that I recorded. So I can go select anywhere on this macro and hit the play button, and now you'll see it automatically does that for me. Now, it's not really practical to go into Visual Basic and click the play button. I mean, that's not really an efficient way to do it. So one thing you could do is assign a button. So if I go to Insert, Shapes, let's say this shape, and then I'm going to right-click, Assign Macro. And Macro 1 is the one that I've created. Hit OK. And what I could also do is edit the text here and say macro 1, and let's bold this, center this, make it really big. So I know that that's macro 1. So now I've assigned this button to that macro that I just created. So now I don't need to go back into the developer tab, launch Visual Basic. I can just click this button here. So I'm going to delete this, and now let's run the macro again. This time I'm just going to click this button. And now it runs it for me. So just like that, we've created a macro, assigned a button to it, in less than a minute's time. So it's really really quick to develop macros just by using the recorder. Sure, they're not going to be the most sophisticated macros right off the bat, and they're not going to be the most versatile, especially if your data set changes, you've got things in different columns. But if you're doing a lot of repetitive things over and over again, the macro recorder can help you. And by going into Visual Basic, you can also change some of these ranges. Like, okay, if this range isn't right, let's say we want to apply the auto fit for columns A through G, right? We could change this to do that, right? Instead of just column G. So now if I were to delete this, and let's purposely shrink these columns so they're all really small. Now when I run the macro, it auto fits everything. So just by doing that small modification, I can adjust my macro. Because you don't have to be an experienced programmer to figure out, okay, this is looking at column F, this is looking at the range G2 to G1000, right? You can use the macro recorder to help you. And if you go on the web, if you search for certain macros, and a lot of websites on there will share the different codes on there, and you can just paste that entire thing in here, and then go in and let's say create a button, assign a macro, and select that macro that you've created or that you've copied from somewhere else. All it involves is let's say sub new macro. And I put in my code, right? We can say columns, A to A, A to A dot entire column dot autofit, and now I can run this macro here. So again, let's test it out. A to A. So just like that, we've created a brand new macro, just coded it in there. And so if you found some code that you wanted to use, sounds promising, you could dump that into a new sub procedure like this, and we can go back to right click assign macro. We've got that new macro in there. Hit OK. And now, okay, let's purposely shrink this down. Now it's just doing that one action. So it really doesn't take a whole lot to get started in learning how to do macros. And, initially for the first few years or first year even, I probably just spent a lot of time with the macro recorder looking on forums and seeing what other people were doing or how they were approaching some of these problems, and maybe copying their code, maybe making adjustments to it to fit what I needed to do, and learning that way. And then eventually I'd end up picking up an actual book on VBA to actually code from scratch, because a lot of this code isn't the most efficient. Like if I wanted to copy a value over, for instance, one of the cool things actually about the macro recorder is that I can record macros side by side while seeing what the code spits out. So let's say I want to do a split screen. What I can do is move this on to one side of the page, and now I've got my macro Visual Basic on one side and my actual file on the other. So let's say I wanted to create a new macro and I just want to copy this value over. So I'm going to go to record macro, hit OK, right click copy, and then Control V to paste it. Right? So this is going to copy the formula over, but the point is, to do that, it's a lot of steps. You copy the selection, you selected the range you wanted to, and then you paste it, and then it turns the copy mode off. But once you learn how to use VBA, you realize that there's a lot more efficiency that you can create by learning how to code properly. So if I did sub copy value, my new macro, what I can do is just say, range G2, which is what I selected here, copy, and then the destination, which it helps you determine, I can put in range, let's say L2. So I'm going to copy it into here. So that's all that's required to do a copy and paste. Hit the play button. I've copied it over. So Through the macro recorder, it's a bit more inefficient because all these steps are recorded, whereas realistically you just need one line to do a copy and paste. So, but the point is, you can get started using the macro recorder, and that can be an easy way to learn what these different actions or how these different actions look on the Visual Basic side. So if I go back to, actually I'm still recording here. If I go back to record a macro, and let's say I want to make several changes, I'm going to change this to, say, yellow, this one to blue. You can see side by side all the things that it's doing. That it's got a color value, it's got a color index. So all these different things on there that you may need to factor in when you're making some of these changes. But it's an easy way to learn the code initially. And sometimes I'll use the macro recorder if I've forgotten the syntax as to how something works. Especially pivot tables can be incredibly complicated. Like if I go back to record another macro, let's say I want to create a pivot table. It's a really simple thing, but you can see there's a pivot cache. You've got all these different values in here. So just creating a pivot table created all those different lines of code using the macro recorder. And again, you probably don't need all of them, but you can see that some of these references can be pretty specific. Pivot cache, create, source type, all that sort of thing. So it's still useful even after you've learned how to code this, because the macro recorder gives you a lot of information that you can use. So in short, I'll say that it's definitely worthwhile to learn macros, because you don't necessarily have to devote an entire course. You don't have to set aside hours, after work to learn this. You can actually learn this while you're at work. The next time you do a repetitive task, record it through a macro recorder, and then maybe create a button, assign it, and the next time you run that task, use that macro. So just baby steps like that to get you in the habit of at least considering, what sort of steps are you repeating every single day, or that, a macro recorder could potentially help with. And then, if you get comfortable enough, look at Google and do searches for certain macros that you want to do. How do we do X, or how do we do Y, right? And then look for that code, copy it into one of these macros, and adjust it so that it works for the type of file that you're working with. So things like that can be really easy ways to get started and learning how to do code. And it doesn't have to take a whole lot of time or a lot of dedication to get into it. And once you start learning it, you'll get better at it and more comfortable picking it up. So my biased opinion is that absolutely it's worth spending the time to learn how to do macros and coding this stuff, just because it'll advance your skill set and save you a lot of time in the process, especially the more complex your macros are and the more you learn about VBA.